Let's bring Charles Prestrud on. He is our Cole Center for Transportation Director, and he has been with us quite some time. And I was just telling Charles earlier today, whenever I hear Charles speak or whenever I read an email from Charles, I learn something about transportation that I didn't know before, or I'm reminded of something that I didn't know in as full of detail. So, Charles, what are the major transportation issues the legislature has been working on so far this session that you've been following?
Well, the big challenge for the legislature this session has been the transportation budget. Usually in a short session, they pass a supplemental transportation budget that makes small changes or additions to the biennial budget that is adopted in odd years. But this year, the legislature has a big budget gap to fill. And it may seem strange because just a year ago, they passed a transportation budget that was balanced. But 9 months later, they were looking at a multi-billion-dollar shortfall. So you might wonder, how did that happen? Well, four main reasons. The first is big overruns on the major construction projects. For instance, on the 520 completion connecting Montlake to I-5, there was about I think a 40% or more increase in the bid on that, which is another $500 million that wasn't budgeted. Then they got another bad surprise. There's a court order that's been in place for a number of years requiring the state to replace a bunch of culverts and other barriers to fish passage. Now, the state's been working on that, but they found out this fall that the cost estimate for completion went from $4 billion to $8 billion. Yeah, $4 billion is a big chunk of change. And then to complicate matters further, the ferry system has a plan to electrify the fleet, and costs for that work have also been going up. The first round of bids they had came in about 75% over the the ferry system cost estimate. So they went back to the drawing board on that. And then the last thing is the state has many years of deferred maintenance on highways and bridges, and that's now starting to come back to haunt us. The cost estimates for that have gone up dramatically. A little over a year ago, they estimated it was going to take an extra $350 million per year to bring the system up to what they call a state of good repair. But then last summer, they took another crack at it and they came up with a much higher number, $770 million a year to bring the state up to a state of good repair. So the legislature is scratching their head trying to figure out how they can come up with the money to do this. There's really no appetite for increasing taxes right now, since it's an election year and people are already unhappy about high gas prices. And they've never been happy about license tab fees and things like that. But so far, there's no agreement on where the additional funding, and it has to be a lot of funding, is going to come from.
Well, that brings me to a quick follow-up here on let's start, first we'll get to the ferry system in a minute and also the highway maintenance, but you mentioned the culverts spending and how it's kind of ballooned. Knowing, of course, that all these things were court ordered a while back, why are the costs, why is it costing so much to do these kinds of fixes? I mean, I'm also guessing that when it comes to salmon, that these are not necessarily the projects that will do the most good, which makes it a shame that these things are ordered, because you might have been able to achieve a greater result somewhere else, but there's probably not room for a trade-off or something. So why are these things ballooning to such astronomical costs?
Well, the State Department of Transportation has explained that they're suffering from higher costs due to inflation, which that's believable. And also the bid climate has changed. There's so much major civil engineering work going on right now that the limited number of firms who specialize in that kind of thing can really kind of pick and choose their projects. And the Washington State Department of Transportation is not the only one facing this. The Port of Seattle with the airport expansion, Sound Transit has had huge cost overruns. So that's that's a big part of it. And also, I think it was a case of the Department of Transportation having to move up the learning curve. When they first got the court order, they weren't sure how much it was going to cost to do these. And they made some rough estimates of what an average culvert replacement might be. But it turns out there's a very wide divergence between cheap and easy culvert jobs and some that are very, very challenging. You know, they're in difficult locations, they're
Oh
big.
yeah, I'm
And
only
you know,
laughing because I've seen these culverts before, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, I wouldn't want to average it out because average seems like there's a lot of normal ones that are just fine, and then there's some that you just think, oh my gosh, this is going to
yes.
cost a fortune. Yeah.
But to expand on the other point you made, uh, the state is looking at this and saying, well, we'll do this. It's a corridor. We don't have much choice. But, some of these culverts we're replacing, there's a city or county road that's blocking stream flow just a couple hundred yards farther upstream. We're not really improving much habitat. Wouldn't it be smarter to identify all of the culverts and impediments and do this in a coordinated fashion with other agencies in cities and counties so that we get the maximum habitat restoration for the dollars that we're putting into it, which is a perfectly sensible thing, but it's not consistent with the way the court order was worded, which is directed just to the State Department of Transportation. And as you might imagine, the cities and the counties are not in any hurry to get dragged into what they see as a bottomless pit of costs and obligations in the future.
I'm just wondering though if it won't end up being another lawsuit against the cities and the counties for having whatever problems they have, and they'll be in the same boat as the Department of Transportation. So they might as well start planning on clearing what they can right now, showing some kind of good faith effort.
I am surprised that hasn't happened yet. And it has been suggested that the Department of Transportation go back to the judge and say, we think we've got a better plan for going about this that will do more sooner to improve habitat and allow us to go about it in a much more efficient and cost-effective way. It's still going to be expensive, no matter how you do it, but they could get more bang for the buck in a cooperative arrangement. Whether the tribes would go along with that, I don't know. They were the ones who instituted the lawsuit. So,
yeah, that would be the big question mark. But I'm assuming that that if they talked to the tribes and actually had a plan in place instead of a kick the can down the road, well, we've got a plan in place. It's going to take us about 20 years to get to it. I'm sure that's not going to fly. They'd rather just have something done. But having a plan in place might be persuasive. You mentioned the ferry system too. And the ferry system, I saw a political cartoon over the weekend too, with the ferry system kind of acknowledging that, yeah, it's going to take us a few years to catch up finally, which is what you've been saying for a couple of years now. And what's the legislature right now considering? Are they taking a look at what the directives were of the governor and how that slowed down, or what are they looking at right now?
well, you're right. Some of the ferry system's problems are attributable to two executive orders issued by Governor Inslee. One was in 2018 when he directed the department to shift to a zero emissions fleet, which has turned out to be a far more costly and difficult undertaking than was realized at the time. And then during COVID, he issued an executive order mandating vaccinations for all state employees, which resulted in the dismissal or early retirement of 132 state ferry system employees, which is why they no longer have enough crew for all the routes.
Let me just remind people of what you've said in the past here, which is that unlike other jobs where somebody might think, well, just grab some new employees there, that a lot of these jobs are highly trained jobs that you have to get a certain, what is it, Coast Guard licensure for, certification for. So it's not like you can just grab people off the street that happen to enjoy boating and throw them into these jobs. We've really left ourselves in a problem with staffing because of mandates that were conducted under the assumption that if you got a vaccine, you wouldn't be able to spread COVID. Then it turned out if you get a vaccine, you can still spread COVID. So 90% or more of the whole rationale for the mandate has disappeared, but nobody's willing to backtrack because of the politics surrounding COVID. So Just throwing in my editorial comment there.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And, it does take years to work up to being a captain or a first mate. And the same for the senior engineer positions. These are not people you just hire off the street. And frankly, there aren't that many people who have the kind of qualifications that are needed in the first place. So the ferry system, which already knew that it was facing a challenge with a lot of senior employees who were approaching retirement, or in a lot of cases already eligible for retirement, they can't find replacements. So it will be probably a number of years before they're fully staffed. And that's assuming all goes well. And I will give the ferry system some credit because they are working hard now to get people enrolled in training programs, to promote from within, to do more recruitment. But it's not easy because there just aren't that many people out there willing to do it, and not that many willing to start at the bottom of the seniority list, which means you get the worst choices in terms of which shifts and which routes and things like that. Whereas in the private sector, it's a little bit easier to start higher up on the totem pole.
Yeah, well, welcome to the Christmas run on the ferry system.
Yeah.
You mentioned House Bill 2497, this proposal to set up a committee to look at revenue needs and procuring the hybrid electric ferry procurement. How does this function? What are the challenges you see with it? What are the advantages of it, if any?
The most recent version of the bill that I have seen was really focused just on future revenue needs. And because ferry system costs keep going up, they know that the current revenue that are dedicated to the ferry system are going to be inadequate. This is not a new problem for the ferry system. They went through a very similar study back in 2009. The concern I have is that they're really only looking at one side of the equation. Looking at revenue doesn't address the question of what are the cost trends for the agency. And that's where they have a lot of problems. For instance, cost per hour for operating a ferry has gone up 47% since 2013. The cost per passenger has gone up 60%. Cost per vessel mile of service has gone up over 50%. At the same time, the number of passengers has fallen by 23%. So you don't need to be a CPA to see that you're going to have a problem if you have fewer customers, but you have significantly higher costs.
Why do we have fewer customers? Is it the commuting difference with COVID, where more people are staying at home for the most part, or because I would think with the shortened service and stuff that demand would actually be up and there'd be more passengers per ferry?
Well, the number of passengers I cited was the total number of boardings, not the number per hour.
Okay.
But you raise a good question, and it is thought that there are probably three major causes to the decrease in ridership. One is COVID, and that significantly reduced the number of people who are riding. Second, as you mentioned, now we have far more people who are working from home. So the regular commuters who used to take the ferry, especially from Bainbridge Island and North Kitsap, a lot of them are working from home now. And on top of that, I would add that Kitsap Transit now provides fast passenger-only ferry service from Southworth, Bremerton, and Kingston. And that competes very effectively for people who are in a hurry and who are coming from those places to downtown Seattle, which was the major market. And on top of that, the ferry system has increased fares every year or two, and for the last 4 or 5 years at least. So the combination of higher fares, less frequent service, less reliable service, superior alternatives, the ferry system has reduced their ridership forecasts for the next few years, but I think they're going to need to ratchet them down even more longer term because the market has shifted and there just is not as much demand, and there are attractive alternatives.
Well, and I mean, I know I know of at least 3 instances in the last year where people have said, "No, I'd like to take the ferry," and then they check online about the waiting times and realize they have to create a reservation in advance, and they decide, I'm driving around or I'm going somewhere else, and so I'm sure there's impact there.
Yeah, the ferry system does offer reservations on the run up in the San Juans and on the Port Townsend to Whidbey Island run. Those are the only two where they offer reservations, and that's a good thing, assuming they can actually provide the service, which has been a little bit of a problem, especially up in the San Juans, where boats conk out or they don't have enough crew. And what do you do then? You've got a dock full of people who have reservations, but there's no ferry. So that's definitely an area for improvement.
Could be worse. You could be on an airplane and have the window fly off. I'll take the ferry system on that one.
Yeah, their safety record is very good that way. I'll give them that. Yes.
Yeah. So, but you mentioned on this bill, the committee, it seems to me it sets up what is frequently the case with committees from a legislative body, which is it presents a fait accompli. The way it's set up is we need you to look for revenue. And it's another way of saying we need you to justify tax increases or fee increases that we want, because they're not opening it up to, we need you to take a look at the costs associated and the revenue here so we can find out, where we might have inefficiencies, or we might have rules in place that are artificially inflating the costs. For example, trying to go to the zero emission fleet is just enormously expensive and foolish when you could achieve all, the same result, environmentally speaking, in a different, much cheaper way. So it seems to me that this committee is kind of set up to create a political camouflage rather than to actually find out, what are the revenue needs and challenges, the real ones, as a whole for the ferry system.
I don't disagree at all. In fact, when I read the bill, I thought, I could have saved them a lot of time and money because I could write them the recommendations of this committee tomorrow. You don't have to wait a year and a half for them to go through all the steps. These are not new issues, and we understand perfectly well what the situation is.
Let's do that, Charles. Let's I want you to write these down. Write what the committee recommendations will be. We'll write them down. We'll seal it in an envelope, and we'll throw it in the mailbox and mail it to ourselves. And we'll do a time capsule so that later we'll video it, and then whenever this thing is supposed to report back, we can go back and open it and see how close you were to the actual recommendations. Because I'm betting that you're going to nail about 96% on that one. Maybe more.
I always enjoy saying "I told you so," but the disappointing part about that is it means that we didn't get the right study done the first time around.
Yeah.
So there will be a hearing on that bill tomorrow, and I intend to testify and give them some encouragement to change the scope and the focus a little bit. It'll be a little bit harder study to do, but it'll be a lot more meaningful if the legislature is really serious about tackling this problem.
Be sure to include the line, "I can save you the money of this committee," because I'll tell you what the recommendations are right now. Nothing but gold. You also mentioned the needs of highway maintenance, and we see this. When we had I thought there'd be a greater emphasis for a longer term, and I keep being proven wrong because there's. I keep going back to, I think it was Neil Postman's book, "Amusing Ourselves to Death" in the 80s. Where the capacity that people have to ignore very prominent things is just amazing to me. When, for example, we had about a 4-foot pothole open up, off the West Seattle Bridge, that, the pothole's so big and you're looking all the way down at this massive hole. And I thought, well, that's going to be symbolic. That's something where people are finally going to say, what, this state is not taking highway maintenance seriously. We're going to crack down on that. There's going to be some political consequences. But for the most part, it looks like it's one-off and quickly forgotten. You mentioned that, hey, the State Department of Transportation is noticing this need for highway maintenance. How big is this problem? How urgent is the problem? And do they have any plan whatsoever? And I should say, and how did we get to this problem? And then do we have any plans?
Oh, simple questions.
Yeah.
This problem is not a surprise. It has been many years in the making. And it's unfortunate because when I went to work for the Department of Transportation back in 2001, the state of Washington was known for having a high degree of highway maintenance. They took some pride in it. But the legislature is always wrestling with competing needs. And politicians usually favor new projects as opposed to maintaining old ones. They like something where there's ribbon cutting and where they can get matching federal funds and things like that. And as the years went by, the legislature's emphasis kind of shifted away from highways to other things, all kinds of, bike, pedestrian, transit, complete streets. Those are not necessarily bad things, but they don't address the state's obligation to maintain the state highway system, which is actually built into the state constitution. And in the last 10 years in particular, the state has tended to fall far short of the preservation and maintenance, which clearly is needed. And I'll give the Department of Transportation guys some credit because they're actually very good at highway maintenance, but they don't do nearly enough of it. And when I worked for the department, the maintenance guys were always hitting us planners over the head saying, hey, your priorities are screwed up. I didn't argue with them, and time has proven them to be correct. The other reason this is so urgent is not only does it create roadway hazards when you've got big expansion joints failing and big potholes being created and chunks of concrete flying up and hitting your windshield and things like that. When pavement is allowed to deteriorate to a certain point, it isn't enough just to go do a quick repave job or fill a few potholes. It damages the base underneath, and you have to do a complete reconstruction. And that costs many times as much. It's much harder to do. I mean, like it's anywhere 5 to 7 times as expensive. And the state now is getting to the point where there are a lot of stretches of highway where they're going to have to tear them up and completely rebuild them, which takes a lot longer to do as well as costing a lot more.
So if we thought gridlock was bad now, just wait till they start having to repair the parts of the highway that are totally falling apart structurally.
Well, you're right. And in fact, I-5 through Seattle, which is not in good condition, I believe I think the northbound lanes are due to be repaved maybe this summer or the following year if they have enough money. And so there's the good news is the Department of Transportation and a number of other entities and organizations have been lobbying the legislature pretty heavily, saying, hey, you really need to get up to speed on this. The challenge for the legislature is finding the revenue to do it. They don't want to back away from the commitments they've already made to complete the major projects, which they need to find more money for. My hunch is what we will see in this short session of the legislature is a big Band-Aid where they borrow a little money from the general fund, shift it over to the motor vehicle fund to fund maybe 1 or 2 years worth of increased repaving and preservation. But that's not, that's just a small down payment, and it's not going to come close to the $770 million per year that's needed in addition to what was already budgeted.
I thought they just had a cap and trade tax on carbon so that they could just pour all that money into the deferred highway maintenance.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because you're absolutely right. The state has been raking in a ton of money. I think it's more than $1 billion in carbon emissions tax revenue.
Yeah.
The problem is when they wrote that bill, they specifically prohibited using the carbon emissions tax revenue for highway projects.
I am shocked to find out that they have revenue problems as a result of this.
Well, it's an unfortunate irony that the people who are actually paying most of that carbon tax are people who are buying gas or diesel fuel, but the revenue can't be used to fix the roads that people are driving on. And the legislature has not shown any willingness to relax that restriction. the voters may see it differently come November when they have a chance to vote to repeal that.
They need a slogan like "gridlock is green" or something, because that's what it's going to end up doing, is creating this series of gridlock. And that's just crazy. So you don't get the sense that there's any unified front or any prominent tax idea or something coming down the pike that we should be aware of for this revenue stream they say they need.
A number of ideas have been floated. One that I think could work pretty well, both in terms of revenue generation and politically, is to shift some or all of the sales tax the state collects on the sale of automobiles from the general fund, where it goes now, to the motor vehicle fund, where it could be used for transportation projects. The Department of Transportation would obviously benefit significantly from that. It's a source of revenue that grows right along with inflation, or even a little bit faster. And it generates enough so that it would take care of a lot of the state's transportation funding problems. The downside to it politically is that the state agencies that depend on the general fund don't like the idea of giving up any sales tax revenue. So in the past, on a few occasions, the legislature has done a one-time transfer from the general fund to the transportation fund, but thus far they have been unwilling to commit to any permanent redirection of the sales tax on automobiles.
Yeah, I think we've had a pretty massive transfer from drivers to the to other funds with the carbon tax. So
Yep.
so this seems to me to be at least an interesting a way to try and create more of a user fee approach to solving this problem for drivers, especially when they say the tax revenue on gas itself is in decline.
What I think we're going to see is just a Band-Aid this year, and then if initiatives pass in November that repeal the Climate Commitment Act, then the state legislature in 2025 is going to have a much more difficult budget conversation. And I think we'll see a number of new ideas. And it's entirely possible that they'll look at another kind of carbon tax in addition to other things. So we'll see.
Well, if there's one thing I've learned about budgeting, from personal experience, it's the longer you can kick things down the road before addressing them, the better off you are. just let it pile up.
You're joking, but that is the way the legislature has operated on this for 10 years, and it didn't solve any problems. It made them bigger.
Oh, I'm having such a sense of deja vu from talking about this for so many years about what the challenges are, the problems are building, and you just think, my word, we just need 1 year of common sense to set the path straight again, and then you guys can continue to flounder around for the next 20 years. But you just need that 1 year to direct things, get them back in line, and then we can have the slow decay again. Heidi's asking, are you following the issues in Southwest Washington as part of your coverage? The I-5 bridge replacement's a big issue down here, and there's a question of whether more bridges are needed.
I have looked at that a little bit, and as you know, a number of years ago, there was a plan to replace the I-5 bridge between Vancouver, Washington, and Portland. And that plan fell apart at the last minute, largely because a state senator from Southwest Washington noted that it was not terribly fair to his constituents. And a major problem is that elected officials on the south side of the river have insisted upon including light rail in the project. More recently, a stumbling block has been that cost estimates keep going up. What had been maybe a $5 billion project is now maybe a $7 billion project. We're supposed to see a draft supplemental environmental impact statement for the project this spring. I think originally it was due out late last year, but anyway, later this spring we should see that. And it'll be very interesting to see what they estimate as the impacts and the benefits and costs. And
You're a planner, so I understand you have a better knowledge of this than me. But as a layperson, when I hear about environmental impact statements on, places that have basically been paved for my lifetime, and that somebody's going to replace that pavement with new pavement, maybe widen it a little bit, or 10 feet here, 10 feet there, and then there's the environmental impact statement. I just picture it as I know that we're employing people to go and create studies, but common sense tells me that it's not too big of an impact if you're just doing the same thing in a different way, or even the same way, structurally speaking. I mean, am I wrong there? Or is there greater value and a greater disparity in these things than? I feel like they all say the same thing. We're going to have to spend more money on this than we expected. It's got to be a little more expensive, but we'll be able to do it if you pay these particular groups off with consultant fees and other things. Am I wrong here, or what?
Well, in this particular instance, the new bridge they're talking about is sufficiently different, and the inclusion of light rail means that it's not really a like for like exchange.
That's true. You're going to have a pretty long bridge to get the ramp up, to have it flat enough to service light rail if you're still committed to the idea of having light rail on this bridge.
Yes. And to answer the person's question, I think there's a pretty strong case that additional roadway capacity across the Columbia River in the general vicinity of Portland is needed, and certainly will be in the future, given the rate of growth. I mean, Clark County has a population of about 500,000 people now. That's a lot of folks. Whether the highest priority is replacing that bridge, adding light rail, or doing something else, I think is a fair question to ask. For instance, when I was down in Longview, looking at the old bridge across the Columbia River there, it's going to be 100 years old pretty soon. It's an old steel bridge, high maintenance, doesn't meet current standards. They need to start planning for how they're going to replace that right away. As far as I know, there are no plans currently in the works. If it was up to me, I would delete light rail from the I-5 project, which would make it cheaper and simpler. Cheaper, by the way, by about $1.5 billion or $2 billion, and use some of those funds to accelerate planning for replacement of the Longview Bridge, the Lewis and Clark Bridge.
Yeah, it's just incredible to me that we have these things where this is what we want, and it's going to be, as you point out, $1 to $2 billion more. We don't have enough maintenance money, and we don't have enough money to finish the projects that we have. This other bridge is structurally deficient, and you have to replace it. And yet people cling to the idea that we can't possibly create the alternative without getting the thing that we want that is extra money that we don't actually have. You know what I mean? Like sometimes in personal life, you say, you know what, I've always really wanted, a Land Rover, a brand new Land Rover, but all I can afford is the minivan, and I have to move my kids, but I'm not buying a car until I can get that Land Rover. And then you're losing your job because you can't show up. The kids aren't showing up to school because you can't drive them. It would make no sense, and people would think you're insane. But in government, it's standard practice. It's a bizarre thing. You also gave me a great idea, which is if there is another bridge needed in that area, you should just make the promise. The government does this all the time, except reverse. Make the promise, say, look, we're going to get to this light rail bridge in a moment. First, we've got to get this other bridge here for the traffic. Then we're going to do the light rail bridge. Then you cancel the second bridge later or kick it down the road for a future study. And you can just do that in perpetuity. But that seems to be the best solution to this.
You're sounding cynical there.
Yeah, I know. I'm in a mood. I'm in a mood today. You got me in a mood because
But by the way, from what I've heard from legislators, they're already committed in the last session to providing $1 billion for the I-5 bridge replacement, and the state of Oregon Department of Transportation has a similar $1 billion commitment. Washington state legislators have made it clear they do not want to back away from that or to postpone work on the project. So it's very likely to move ahead, but they may get sticker shock later this spring when they see the revised cost estimate. They may discover that $1 billion they've committed doesn't even cover the cost increase for the project. So we'll see.
Somebody needs to do a quick testimony where they say, picture this as the most complicated culvert replacement ever conceived. Just so you have an idea, and maybe that'll wake them up a little bit as far as what's possible and what's not. John asked the question, is there any chance of turning the ferry system over to the private sector?
The short answer is no. And I know that seems strange since once upon a time, the ferry system was privately operated. But federal labor law and political realities would make it extremely difficult. The one place that the ferry system could, I think, turn over service to a private operator is the route from Anacortes to Vancouver Island. Ferry system used to operate that service. When COVID hit, the border was closed, service was suspended. It has not restarted. And the ferry system has recently acknowledged that it'll be 2030 before they have a ferry and a crew needed to restart that service. And it seems to me that, we know there are private operators that are interested in providing the service, and they could get it started and up and running a whole lot sooner. Probably not in time for this year, but certainly for 2025. And that's something that I wish the legislature and the ferry system would seriously entertain.
Yeah, at least it would make for interesting comparisons, and you could see what the different practices were and maybe learn something from one another.
Fares would probably be significantly higher, but customer service probably a little bit better.
Yeah, and it's the only alternative. I mean, if people say, well, gosh, the fares are too high, well, it's the only service in town, and it's not, I mean, even if they say they're going to start service, by 2030 at the earliest, judging from the various other problems they have with other parts of our highway system, and I count the ferry system as part of the highway system, obviously, the ferry highway system, they'll be lucky to get to it in 2030 for sure.
Yeah, there's no guarantee.
No. Hey, Charles, really fascinating stuff. I know transportation becomes bigger and bigger as the end of the session looms, and these things are debated, so I'm sure we'll have you on again. Thanks so much for providing all the information, and look forward to seeing your work at washingtonpolicy.org.
Thank you, David. Happy to help.
Thank you. All right, then thank you for joining us. Remember, next week we're going to start our 12:15 time. That'll be a 15 minutes after noon for our Washington Policy on the Go. We're here every week during the legislative session, and we'll see you next week. And don't forget, this one will be on YouTube shortly, so you can share it with your friends, family, whoever you think is interested, and we hope you will do so. Thanks again. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. Visit us at washingtonpolicy.org.